back to What the Fertility Season 2. This morning, we are so excited to sit down with Jennifer Gobrecht. She was born with MRKH and underwent a uterine transplant. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me and letting me share my story and journey with having a deceased donor uterus transplant.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, deceased versus living donor. And I know we're going to get into that and just the details of how everything kind of unfolded for you. But obviously being born with MRKH, that's like a pretty young diagnosis, right?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed with Mayer-Rokitansky-Kuster-Hauser syndrome when I was 17. You hear a lot of stories with women with MRKH. Their stories are going to be a little similar, is that, you're a teenager, you haven't gotten your period yet, you're not really sure why, you kind of get shipped around to a lot of doctor's appointments, and then finally you're given this diagnosis. And as a teenager, like, that's just not something that you're thinking about at all. Like, to be told at 17, you don't have a uterus, it's such a hard thing to process. What does that mean for family planning? What does that mean for the rest of my life? Like, I totally thought I was, quote unquote normal. And here I am, like, my whole life now is going to be very different because of this diagnosis. And I have type 1 MRKH, so I was born without a uterus and without a cervix. But, there are two types of MRKH. Some women might only have one kidney. They might not even have a vaginal canal. There's other health concerns with type 2. So, I do like to just reference what type I have and kind of my experiences with it.
Yeah, and I heard you allude to it saying not getting a menstrual cycle. Is that typically probably the first sign that something might be off?
Yeah, that usually is you still have ovaries. So, you still have that kind of monthly feeling, but there's no bleeding. So there's no uterus, there's no cervix, nothing's leaving the body. So, um, your ovaries kind of just sort of, when the eggs go, they just sort of dissipate into your body. And that's kind of the big red flag, is there's no bleeding externally. So what's
Yeah,
going on there?
I thank you for mentioning that, because obviously, so I didn't include it in your intro, but you went through IVF. And so obviously to undergo IVF, you have to have the eggs and ovaries. So that is like a big clarifying standpoint of it's just the uterus that's missing, correct?
Yeah, uterus and cervix
Okay.
in my case. And as I said, other people might have different situations, but for the type 1 MRKH I really just didn't have a uterus or a cervix.
And so what are the statistics in that for women? Because I was sharing this morning with my sister-in-law, and I'm like, it is a rare disease, but I feel like I hear about it more and more. And is disease it's probably not the right term, maybe diagnosis.
Syndrome, I guess, is more the way they would phrase that. But we still kind of recognize the rarity of it on Rare Disease Day, things like that. But I would say that it's about 1 in 4,500. Sometimes, depending on what statistics you're looking at, it's between 1 in 4,500, 1 in 5,000. As I think the internet and more data is available, because this is something that can happen anywhere in the world, that, I think we're getting more data that number is becoming a little bit more common than the original 1 in 5,000. We're looking at more 1 in 4,500, maybe even less than that.
Yeah.
But uterine factor infertility, isn't just MRKH. And kind of the onset of why uterus transplants are interesting is you've got hysterectomies and other uterine factor infertility situations. And that you're probably looking at 1 in 500. So a lot more common when you look at uterine factor infertility as a whole.
Yeah, and I want to get into that, but I'm gonna go back to when you were 17, because I feel like when I was 17, right, the last thing I was thinking about was having kids. I was probably thinking about, how do I not have kids? So walk listeners through what that process was like for you.
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, I think in part, in the back of my mind, I was like, well, I'm going to have to figure out a way. I want to have a family, whether I'm going to have to save up for an adoption or save up for a surrogacy, gestational carrier. When I'm looking at what I want to do for my to do as a job for the rest of my life. Like I want to find a company that offers IVF coverage. Like those are the types of things going through my 17-year-old brain, not like, what am I going to pick out for prom? Like those were such
Wow.
different like mindsets, that I was kind of, struggling with, because it's like, this is now going to affect everything I choose. Like I don't get to organically kind of go through those
And
processes.
probably like dating and finding a partner and all of that as well. It's always going to be in the back of your mind.
Yeah, and I made a very early on decision that, like, I my husband knew I had MRKH before we even started dating. Like I was very like, I'm not going to hide this, because I don't ever want to feel like I'm ashamed of it. Like I want it to be part of who I am, and like what I want people to know about me. And especially the person you're dating. Like I want it to be like full transparency. So, my husband knew I had MRKH before we even really started dating. And he was very like, I think having a supportive partner, like, who's ready to like, someday we'll, look into adoption or surrogacy, and like be on board like from the onset. Because we started dating when we were like 19 and 20. So like he was
Yeah.
very, very mature for his age, for kind of being on board with that mindset.
That's so beautiful. I love that. So you're diagnosed 17, you start thinking of all these things. And I'm assuming back then, because what was that? Like maybe in early 2000?
It was, yeah, 2004. Like there was really no internet, there was no support groups, like Facebook barely existed. Like, and I would say that like when I was first diagnosed, it was really just like you were by yourself. Like you didn't really have a lot of community. Like you had nobody to talk to, nobody knew what you were going through. But I would say that as like the world of social media evolved, like Facebook started to have support groups on there, and like being able to connect with people like you, or watching Survivor and finally seeing somebody on Survivor with MRKH, things like that, where it started to become part of like, more accessible, more people talking about it, more people connecting, a lot of it through the evolution of the internet and social media. That for me was a big thing that I got later in life, but didn't have anything when I was first diagnosed. So
Yeah. So I'm assuming that first diagnosis, the physician was like, you can find gestational carrier, you can do adoption, like those two standard. And I'm assuming, and I'll let you tell your story, how you even thought to do a uterine transplant. I mean, when you mentioned that and I saw your profile, I was like, oh my, it's 2023 and I had never even thought of that. And I work in healthcare.
yeah, I mean, I think if you have your finger on the pulse of the world, like you hear all the stories. So my husband and I, we got married around 2014, and that was when Sweden started doing their living donor uterus transplant trial. And the reason Sweden was the first country to kind of really look into this type of fertility treatment is because in Sweden, surrogacy is illegal. So their only choices were adoption. And they felt that they really could show that a uterus transplant works just like any other transplant. And they were able to prove that through births of, multiple children. And then a lot of their physicians ended up going to Baylor in Texas to start another living donor uterus transplant program there. And they started having successful transplants in America. And again, this is like, you're looking at like this in like 2014 is Sweden, and then, late, 20 teens is kind of this Baylor program happening. And, everybody in the MRKH community and in the hysterectomy communities are talking about this, like sharing articles. Did you see this? Or even just the women themselves are in these groups talking about their processes because they want to share their stories. So, you're hearing a lot about these living donor trials and everything that's happening. And I remember turning to my husband and saying, this is so cool for like the next generation. Like, this is so amazing that like in the future, people will have this option, never thinking that like that opportunity would like be available to us.
Oh, that's amazing. And so I hear you say living donor. And so just to break it down for maybe like people that don't know what like a hysterectomy is or why, and I have a question about that. So obviously a living donor, they would have to undergo a hysterectomy, correct?
Correct.
And my question is, I made the naive assumption that you would only undergo a hysterectomy, or the majority of people undergoing a hysterectomy is because there was something wrong, like maybe like severe endometriosis or something like that. But is that not the case?
I mean, I think for these trials, I mean, it also depends on, where you are, but like, for these trials, they're showing there's a medical reason for a person wanting to get a uterus hysterectomy for a uterus transplant trial, and that kind of is all facilitated through that program. Um, they're hoping, I think the long-term goal is that, like, women can have the opportunity to, apply for these hysterectomies that would then be able to be utilized in another person needing a uterus. So like it's kind of laying that groundwork is another opportunity for women to kind of
Okay.
make some
So like even
decisions
if like
there.
they're done, just like childbearing age, they're done, they could say, okay, I want to do an elective hysterectomy and donate.
Yeah, and we've seen, I can kind of sort of talk about it a little bit, but like we've seen like some uterus transplant people from other countries, they've used their mom's uterus, which is kind of really cool. So those types of stories from living donors are really interesting. As I said, like, the information from all around the world, it's growing. More trials are popping up every day. And the goal is that the uterus will kind of has its own criteria for both living and deceased. They want it to be sort of in a certain age range to have been shown that it's had pregnancies before. So
Oh,
that's one of the current caveats, is that like they want to make sure you've had successful pregnancies, whether you are a living or a deceased donor. So that is something. And then always like a different age range, like certain age range, depending on the trial, they sort of set different limits of how old you can be to donate as well.
okay. Okay. So you guys see this coming out in the news and you're talking to your husband about it. And at what point did this really become part of your life where you're like, whoa, maybe I actually could benefit from this?
So, as I said, like as social media kind of grew, I was very active in the MRKH groups. It's such a wonderful community. I can't rave about that enough, because the women that you meet, they're just some of the most amazing warriors I've ever met. But, someone had shared a post that Penn Medicine in Philadelphia was doing a deceased donor uterus transplant trial. And at this point, there was no deceased donor trials that have occurred yet successfully. But, I was, clicked on the link, because I'm like, it's Penn. It's like in my backyard. I live, like, I have to go by it on my way to work every day. Like I'm gonna just look at this, and I'm reading a criterion. Like I met like what the medical conditions they were looking for. I met the age ranges. I met like a lot of the different criterias, which was like I had to have 2 kidneys, which, again, with MRKH, sometimes people don't have 2 kidneys. So that's something that can sometimes be a disqualifier for these types of transplants. Healthy, young, married for X amount of time, or with a partner for X amount of time. And I said to my husband, like, I'm going to apply. It seems like, I'm sure a lot of people are throwing their name in the hat, like, but, I feel like it's in our backyard. It's right here. Like, what is the harm of trying it and seeing it, and seeing where this goes? Like, we've seen that living uterus transplants have like worked in Sweden and in Texas. Like, let's see kind of what this is. And I applied not really thinking like too much, not being too hopeful, but I heard back from the lead investigator not even like 3 days later that she wanted to meet with us. So I was like, oh my goodness, okay, this is a lot more real than I thought. But that first meeting was really kind of laying out the groundwork of what an evaluation process, even to be accepted into a uterus transplant trial, would be. And one of the things in our case is that, we had already started to look into doing, we'd done IVF already at this
So,
point.
so that's where I was gonna ask, and I'm sorry for jumping just into the uterine transplant. So going back, you guys had already explored IVF and completed.
Yeah. Yeah, so we had already explored IVF. As I said, like one of my biggest things, as a younger person, is like I wanted a company that had some great IVF coverage. And I wanted to do it when I was younger too. Because at this point, we were probably, I think I was 29 when we did our first round of IVF. And one of the pieces to applying for uterine transplant program is specifically for the one I applied to. They were hoping you would have 3 tested embryos to be able to apply for the program.
Oh, wow. So they were looking specifically for women that had already done like egg retrieval.
Or if you were going to do the uterus transplant, you would then be expected to go through IVF as well.
Okay. So you were like a step ahead.
Yeah, so we already had that. Had just started looking into gestational carrier surrogacy programs. And we had like really just like had kind of completed that first round of IVF, and then sort of was like just starting to do a little bit more research into surrogacy. So, having this uterus transplant kind of pop up, we were like, okay, well, let's apply and see what it's all about. See what's expected, see which path makes the most sense for us. So, we go and we meet with the lead investigator, and, we talk through, we've already done IVF and had enough embryos for the trial. We would then have to go through evaluations with all of the different teams involved in the trial, because you're going to have your surgical teams, you're going to have your transplant coordinating teams, you're going to have your fertility, like OB team, and then your maternal fetal medicine, like high risk pregnancy team that you're going to talk through. You're going to have your infectious disease team, because, once you have a transplant, you're immunocompromised. You're going to have a pharmacy team of, talking through all the medications you're going to be on. You're going to have a dietitian, because once you have a transplant, your diet changes. So you have all of these meetings with all of these different departments within, the hospital setting. And then the biggest one, which I think is important to really stress, is the psychological evaluation of it all. And that was probably like 6 hours of just kind of talking through like their evaluation of, how they kind of, I guess, evaluate that. But, they evaluated me, they evaluated my husband, they evaluated us together, and really kind of determined whether or not like we were going into this well-informed,
Can I ask a
and
question about this? So
yeah.
obviously uterine transplant is an elective transplant procedure.
Correct.
Are there other organ transplant procedures that are elective, or is this one of the few?
There are, I guess what you would kind of say, life enhancing versus life saving. So
Okay.
think of corneas are transplanted, where you don't need corneas to live,
Okay.
but it enhances your life. There's been hand transplants. So again, you don't need your hands to live, but it enhances your life. So there's,
so I'm assuming that site process is involved in like the life enhancing.
yes,
Okay.
yes. So, and with a clinical trial, because that's what we were embarking on, is you go through all these evaluations, and then there is a internal review whether they think you're a good candidate for their trial. And so we had passed the internal review, and that was really exciting. But then they send all that information out to an external review, where like they don't know anything about you. They've never met you. They're really just looking at all of your stuff on paper, and you're just hoping that everything on there is telling the story that this completely unbiased group is going to be reviewing.
And how many people were they accepting into the trial?
So for their trial, they were hoping to do 3 to start.
Oh my goodness. So like not a lot at all.
Not a lot at all. And, as I said, like there was really only one other, program in the US. Cleveland had a program, but it was on hold at the time when I had applied for the Penn program. But they ended up starting like right around the same time again as well, because they ended up doing a deceased donor transplant that ended up not working. So they kind of paused.
Okay. And I know they didn't do a phenomenal job introducing you in terms of like the statistics for uterine transplant, but there had only been, 1 or 2, correct? Like prior to you for deceased.
By the time I eventually give birth, there was only 2 other deceased donor births.
Wow.
So wild to think about. But when we applied, there were none. Okay. So no deceased donor uterus transplant births. So we knew we'd be probably one of the first few people to kind of undergo this process.
Yeah. Which is just even more like so much faith and trust in the system, and like, we really want to try this.
And I think that it trust is, I think, the perfect word there, because, living kind of in the area of the hospital, like, it is such a trusted hospital. Like, meeting with this group, it's not just us like being evaluated by them, it's us also trusting them to be able to do this when they hadn't done it before.
Worse.
So that is always a little nerve-wracking when you're the first person to do something. Like, this is that person's first transplant. Like, you're like, I have faith in you, because like you know what you're doing. There's other ways that they were able to prepare. Like, they were able to watch living donor ones in Texas. They were talking throughout the world at different kind of, I believe they call them consortiums, but like different conferences that they would all get together and review. And, there was other ways that they kind of prepared for this, even though they hadn't done one yet. I felt very trusting of where they were at with what they did to prepare.
Yeah. So they send you out to this external review, and you're just like probably on pins, and I'm sure you feel more invested at this point.
Yeah. And I mean, I felt that, like, okay, if we made the internal review, like, there's enough of a case there that, like, hopefully we'll make the external review. And then we did. And so that was like a joyous day of like, okay, we're doing this. We had a lot of conversations with our, physicians. We decided we were going to do one more round of IVF. We were nervous as, kind of looking at the very limited living donor data of how many embryo transfers certain people had before they ended up having a successful pregnancy, and trying to do IVF after a uterus transplant. While it's not impossible, it's just a lot harder. So, we made the decision, we'll do another round of IVF, and then we'll wait to be listed, like you would be listed for a deceased transplant of any kind, waiting on that, listing list until you get the call. So, round 2 of IVF, always a little, it's always stressful to do IVF, but IVF with like a uterus transplant in mind is
I know. I feel like
world of stress.
I know. I want to make sure you get the credit for doing IVF at least, 2 times, because that in itself is a whole infertility journey on its own. Like, take away the uterus transplant.
Right. So that was definitely another like added layer to our fertility path. And then, we had, great successes with our second round. And then, it was the waiting game of like, when are we going to get this call? And it's that bittersweet piece, because that call means that somebody has passed away, but, they were an organ donor and are going to be able to help, not only with all of their life-saving organs, but a life-enhancing organ transplant.
So can I ask, and I'm sure you're super well versed in organ transplant, obviously. So right at this point, so say I'm an organ donor and I met those criteria. If you're an organ donor, are the uterus is included in that? That's not like a, or is there?
No, so there was an additional, like, because it's new, there was additional pieces where the family would have to say, yes, you can go ahead and also donate that one as well. So there's the standard organs, but that they
reproductive organ, is that why?
I think it's just because it's really like new. It's just like there really wasn't much of a precedent, so it was more just like an added layer of like making sure, the transplant group made sure, like, are we allowed to, also use this as well? And that.
Well, the only reason I ask is because obviously then the pool of uterine organ donors from deceased, that's probably much smaller than just the regular organ donor pool.
Right. And, there was, while it is smaller, living within, for transplants, you can kind of be so many hours away. So kind of being like not too far from New York, not too far from DC, not too far, like in Philadelphia itself, there's a lot of a larger pool to kind of
That makes sense.
have around, with like their standard practices of what they would use for any organ. But Yeah, I mean, it was a waiting game, but for us, we were only listed for like 2 months before we got the call, which some people in other trials for both, for other places that had deceased donor trials, they were on there for months and months and months. So for us to get that call in 2 months, that was wild.
It has to be,
Like,
because anytime you're going through infertility or wanting to grow your family, time is like the hardest part, like that
the
wait.
waiting.
Yeah, the waiting. And you guys have already been waiting for so long, especially if you had done 2 rounds of IVF. Wow.
Oh,
See this
yeah.
call, and they're like, we're ready.
So yeah, they're like, we have a match, you know, they obviously are going to have to, like, it's a very long process to remove, you know, the organ. And then obviously, so we about a, probably I got the call at 7 on like 7 on like a Friday night, and I had like to be at the hospital at like 2 on Saturday. So like I had some time to get myself together, you
You're so
know.
funny sometimes. It's like less than a day.
Yeah, I mean, I had like a little bit of time to kind
You
of
were
to
like
get
just
myself
running out the
together.
door. Oh my goodness. Okay.
And part of one of the things that was kind of really wild about our process is that they wanted to document everything. So we actually like had a film crew with us too.
Wow.
So we go to the hospital and they were gonna like record, you know, before the surgery, during the surgery, and like check-ins and like things like that throughout the process so that, you know, we can make it more readily available. It's like it's easier to watch a story than to read an article sometimes online to really see what a person, you know, trying this new path goes through. So it was just a wild kind of day of like you roll up to there, there's the film crew, there's the doctors, there's everybody, and it's like a big whole group of people all super excited. One of the cute things that the like transplant nurses do is they typically make you a little cookie of the organ you're getting donated. So they made me a little uterus cookie, and they were like, "Wait, this is our first time making a uterus cookie. This is so cool."
That is
It
so
was really
cute.
sweet. Um, but yeah, it was a wild time, and you know, then by the time you get to the hospital, we probably waited another ugh, 12, 13 hours before I actually ended up going into the surgery room. And that was about a 10-hour surgery. Of course, my husband's like freaking out because he's like, "You're in there for 10 hours."
That's what
Like,
I was gonna ask is like, I mean, you're having an organ transplant. Like that is just so significant. And your husband was on board from the beginning?
I mean, I think what I had said to him, and I think that this is why we both felt very passionate about doing it, is like, it's not just about showing that like we want to grow our family. It's about showing that this is a possibility for more people in the future. Like, if we can show it's, if we take that leap of faith, what will it mean for like the next person? So
That's
that was kind of his
so
motivator.
that's so empowering. That is just insane. And I'm sure he was on pins and needles the whole 10 hours of like, is my wife gonna be okay? Because I'm sure it's a very risky surgery.
I mean, any surgery is going to have, you know, its, you know, risks to it, but it was no more, it was no different really than you would for most transplants. You know, you're
Okay.
still going to have similar kind of processes and similar risks set up, but at least in my case, if for some reason the transplant didn't work, I could still go about my day.
Yeah, that's a
So
great
like, so yeah, it was a wild 10 hours, but I came out on the other side. My husband was like so nervous, but I was cracking jokes like the minute they like woke me up, and I was like, I have a uterus. This is so
And
weird.
I bet that was so just like you probably your whole life was like we're thinking like I'll never have a uterus and be able to carry a child. And now you're like, whoa, all of this possibility now that
It
you have this.
it seriously was surreal. Like I felt like this is science fiction, this is a dream, like this isn't real, but it was. And then the harder part, I guess, was just like keeping everything status quo, like that you've got probably about 6 weeks of sort of recovery from a surgery like that. Um, so I was like home from work for 6 weeks. And then it's like also then trying to navigate your new daily day because then you're on immunosuppressants. So I was taking probably around 37 pills a day, and like had all these like app reminders of when I had to take what medication and how much. And, you're going through routine blood draws to also check all the levels of your medicine. And if you're, showing any, signs for like if any of your levels are too high, they have to adjust things. So like your kidneys could be stressed. They might want to knock down like whatever's going to stress out your kidneys, things like that. And then you're going in for routine biopsies, because with a uterus transplant, they actually transplant the uterus, the donor's cervix, and then a part of the top of their vaginal canal. So it's actually 3 organs in one that they're transplanting when you think of it like that.
Okay.
So
I have so many questions, but I know the end of your story, so I don't want to ask any question until we get there. So I'm going to just like make mental notes, but I have questions about the immunocompromised and the like not the vitamins, the supplements and the pills and the medication, but I want to ask those later. So we'll come back to that.
Yeah, I would say so. When you get the transplant, they're transplanting the uterus, the cervix, and the vaginal canal. So they're doing routine biopsies to check for rejections for that. So not only are you getting blood draws and checks that way, but also like actual tissue checks as well.
Okay.
Which, when you just had major surgery on all of those areas, going in for biopsies, those are probably the most tedious, like really painful parts of the process. Like those are not a walk in the park. They definitely can be really.
Would that be similar to like, so it would be an endometrial biopsy, correct? Or no?
They're like similar. And there were times where we had different kinds of biopsies. Like they would go in and try like test different levels and things like that. But like this, they're actually like taking like pieces of the cervix that was transferred over. So that's kind of how they tested it. But it was just like, think of going in for like a routine like pap smear, but like dialed up.
So the reason I ask is because I did an endometrial biopsy during my IVF journey, and that was the most painful, even more than labor. Like it hurt so bad. And so I can only imagine, especially coming off of like a very intense surgery.
Yeah. So I would say like biopsies were definitely probably like my least favorite part of the whole process. But I like to just like put that out there, because it's not all sunshines and rainbows. It's not like you get a uterus and you go about your day. Like there's a whole healing part of this. And there's like a lot of checkings that can be kind of intense. So like you have to be mentally prepared that like it's going to be, hard on you a little bit, because not only are you, going through like physical things like that, but also you're really changing a lot of your body chemistry with all of the medications that you're taking. And I was on, steroids that I like totally ballooned up, and like I would have like tremors from like some of the immunosuppressants, so that you're like shaking sometimes. Like it can be a lot, like just from all of that.
And I feel like it has to be a unique transplant too, because it's not like, yes, it's working, because you have to then conceive, which in itself with a uterus from birth can be a multi-year journey.
Right. So, well, for the first step really was to show that the uterus was working, in the sense of getting my first period.
Oh my gosh, what do you think about that? Yeah.
Like
so
waiting.
So you're like, hey, can I have menstrual cycles now? Like, can I have a period? Oh my gosh.
So yeah, it took about 37 days before I had my first period.
I don't feel like that's wrong. That's like clockwork.
Yeah, so like it was able to work about like a month after. And the goal was to have a frozen embryo transfer after 6 months of having the uterus and having successful menstrual cycles.
Okay.
So, I had
a wild experience for you after.
Well, yeah. Yes, because it wasn't just like, okay, I'm having my first period at 32, which is like wild. But also like you're having to give every single detail about what's happening to like a whole group of people, and like sending them photos. Like this is so weird sometimes, but like you're like, this is all for science. But here we are. And then just like really, journaling that time, and like every symptom I felt, every situation, like how it was very documented. We were very thorough in just kind of
Have
sharing.
you met anybody that's gone through a similar experience as you now that you're far?
Oh, yes. So a lot of our the women who have had either living or deceased donor transplants, like I started to reach out to some of the living donor women through Facebook and talk to them about their experiences, because everybody's, it's such a small sample size still. Like our experiences can be really different. Um, but I was always turning to them and asking them questions like, is this like, did you have this happen to you? Like, is this normal? And I now try to be that person for other people who are going through it now, because there's not many people to ask like friend to friend question versus like a medical question, like.
Wow, this is so interesting to me. Like, I mean, you're incredible. This is incredible.
Well, thank you. And that's why I like to try to share the story as much as I can, because you never know who's going to be like listening and reach out and, hear more about this being an option.
Yeah, and it's so funny. Like our whole mission is to be inclusive to family building. We are inclusive to family building. Our podcast isn't about like IVF or any of that. It's everything. And to hear your story, I'm like, never in my wildest dreams would I think I'm being inclusive of like uterine transplant. Here's one more thing to the pot that is now an option for women. And I'm super excited about it. So, okay, so you had six cycles and now you're ready to transfer.
Yeah. So we go in for the transfer. It it happened on a Sunday, so it was like not actually as crazy as other times we've gone to the hospital, but it was still like a good chunk of people there. We go in for the transfer, and then you get the 2-week wait, which everybody who has a transfer knows that those 2 weeks are probably some of the hardest weeks. Like I would say waiting those 2 weeks was harder than waiting for the call for the uterus, because like it was like too real now, like that I could be pregnant. But I was definitely like, my doctors were joking, like, try not to do pregnancy tests. Like, we'll call you with your results. Like let's do this like the old fashioned way. And I was like, okay. So I was like, good. I did not do any pregnancy tests. I was waiting for like their call of like my blood work. And one of the things my husband and I wanted to do is we were going to record the call, because we wanted to just like have that. So my husband had the phone recording as we got the call from our doctor, and she's like, I'm cutting right to the chase. You're pregnant. And we just are sobbing. Like it is so surreal to have somebody say to you, you're pregnant, when for 15 years you were told you would never be pregnant yourself.
I mean, I feel like I could cry, and I just met you and you lived with
Like,
that 15 years. I mean, yeah, it's not like you had infertility and you're not going to get pregnant, but then like there's a chance you anatomically could not get pregnant.
right. I was told never, never, never. And then here I am hearing these words, and I was like, this is surreal. Like we cried.
Yeah, and hearing how passionate you are about helping other women and being a pioneer and like trying these new technologies, I'm sure another piece of that is, wow, everything I just went through worked and it can be used for other women.
100%. Like for us, it wasn't just like that I was pregnant, but like it was working, and like this could be an option for the next person. So,
Wow. I bet the team was thrilled too. I bet that just the celebration all around was insane.
I have to say, like, it was such an amazing team to work with. Everybody was just so excited, and then you kind of go from the happy high of, okay, you're pregnant. Now you're going to have a high risk pregnancy. So
Yeah,
that's
now the risk. Yeah.
so that was probably then it was like, okay, let's be cautiously optimistic, was kind of the like term of the trial, is like everybody was just like cautiously optimistic, because
women from loss and infertility can relate. They use that with us all the time. Be cautiously optimistic.
yes, because again, at this point, by the time I was pregnant, the first deceased donor baby was born in Brazil, but it was really just an anonymous like announcement, not there was a ton of like medical case information, but not like their story or who they were.
Yeah.
So nobody I could talk to about it, but you
Yeah.
know, one person already had a baby and now I'm being told I'm pregnant. Like that's amazing. Um, and honestly, like my, first 2 trimesters were really smooth. Like I didn't really
Really?
have any morning sickness. Like, um, other than, with having MRKH and being immunocompromised and just kind of my own like medical history, I ended up getting a lot more UTIs during the process. So that was a little scary. But for the most part, like that was kind of like the big things that happened sort of in that early time.
So can I ask, so obviously immunocompromised, did you have to continue taking the immune medication during the pregnancy?
Yes, so they were using immunocompromising medications that they would use for, people who had like liver, kidney, heart transplants and were wanting to be pregnant. So like they know that like there are some immunocompromising medications that can not be great for pregnancy, but these ones are what they use for women who've had other organs transplanted and then had pregnancies. So there
Okay.
was a lot more data on like we know that using these um, I was on tacrolimus and azathioprine during my pregnancy, and those like they use those in other pregnancies for women of other transplant organs.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense. I never really thought about that, but of course.
Yeah, so like there was some groundworks of that, but I think the thing that was really exciting for us too, not only just being pregnant, but like being able to learn more just in general. Like they are taking a lot more data from all the women who go through a lot of these trials to kind of not only think about answering, you know, regular pregnancy questions, but like, why is it that a fetus doesn't get rejected by its mother when it's, like foreign to that person, but an organ does, and like can we figure that out from these types of trials? Like how
Wow.
do we, because I've had friends who've had like kidney or liver transplants, things like that. They have to be on immunosuppression for life, and like after 15 years that can really you know have long-term effects, like especially people who are younger who have transplants. There's just so much about that immunocompromising that can just have long-term effects that like maybe one day that won't be the case, but like this is one area maybe that they'll be able to figure that out. So I was happy to also give that extra layer of science to like another area to study.
Absolutely. And yeah, and I know, again, I'm going to save my questions for the end so I don't ruin the story. So I heard you say the first 2 trimesters were pretty uneventful, other than all of the testing, and then you get into the third.
Yeah, so the third trimester, I started having hypertension, which was like, really scary, having high blood pressure. I was trying to take it a lot more easier. But then, after kind of having hypertension, I then had gestational diabetes. So that was also another like stressor. And then one day I was in a routine checkup. Um, I had extremely high blood pressure, and they're like, we're going to keep you, just make sure. So they like had me up in like the labor like triage room, like I was like strapped up with a little monitor, and they then said they were worried, it could be a sign of preeclampsia. So we were just kind of hanging out monitoring, and then I got a really bad headache, and that's kind of like a big red flag for preeclampsia. And so, I was far enough along that they're like, okay, we can, do a few more things, and then, we could do the C-section. Like we can, deliver this baby. And, I didn't know if I was having a boy or a girl. I wanted to be surprised. Like I wanted everyone to kind of have that moment of like
Yeah.
surprise. So yeah, we were go time. Like baby was gonna be here soon. So
And you didn't transplant, you have to have a C-section, right? Like that is across the board. Okay.
yes, you have to have a C-section. You also always have to have frozen embryo transfers. They don't connect the fallopian tubes to the uterus. So those are kind of just two things to think about. Like
You
you'll
would
always
always
have
have to do IVF and cesarean. Okay.
Yeah. So, with kind of that really stressful sort of ending, transplant programs, they give you the options, like you can try for another child, um, but really depends on how you feel and how comfortable you feel with how healthy you are at the time. And I just did not feel that I could make it through another pregnancy, that we made the unanimous decision that like we would go through this once, and we were just happy to have a baby. Like, we were
Yes.
told we would never have a child. Like, I'm just happy to have a baby. So we go in, and of course we couldn't even have the delivery in a regular labor room. We had to do it in like a cardiac like one, where because there was like 50 people in there, because you've got like every team possible ready to do whatever they're gonna do, and then you have a whole uh like pediatric team there too for the baby, and like there's the camera crew, of course, because they're documenting everything. And so we're in this like giant room of like 30 people ready to like have this baby, and my husband and I are just like in awe that this is happening. Nervous about the preeclampsia, but like excited to meet our child.
Yeah.
And so they do the C-section, and then my husband gets to tell the room it's a boy. And
Oh, congratulations.
we named him Ben, since he was going to be one of the first babies in Philly. We thought, like, we were big soccer fans, so we're always at the Union games sitting in the Sons of Ben section, and like
Love
love
that.
the historical tie back to Ben Franklin being a famous Philadelphian. So that was kind of our inspiration.
I love that. And I'm assuming that he had no complications. He just
So early, so what they term it like in the NICU is like a feeder and grower. Like, he's too small to like travel home, but like he just has to get bigger. And like when they're born early, sometimes they don't understand how to eat from a bottle, so they still have food like tube feeding. So like we did a lot of practicing with like the staff there. They had like lactation consultants and all of these additional like supporters to like really help us like get him ready to go home when he was a little bit bigger.
yeah.
So.
Okay, so going back, because I held all my questions for this, I didn't want to like spoil the ending. So you had a hysterectomy after the birth, correct?
Right. It was literally like, here's your child. We're gonna
Taking it out.
knock you out, and we're gonna keep going.
That's okay. So many questions. The very first question, and I was just reading up on this, is, and you mentioned it. So you're really only allowed that right now to try 2 times. Is that
Right.
just safety and
Yeah, the big thing is those immunocompromising drugs. It's just a lot on your body, and they really don't want to keep having to support like this enhancing organ for too long, because it's a lot on your body. They don't want you on these drugs for too long, like if you don't have to be.
But
So that was
that's my second question, and I wanted to ask it back when I mentioned it, just because I feel like if someone was listening to this, like, okay, wait, this maybe is an option for me, and then they hear that you have to go on these immunocompromising drugs, they're like, oh, so for the rest of my life. And I didn't want to say like, oh, well, she had it removed. Basically, you had it removed. I'm sure there was a taper period, but today in your daily life, you're not on anything. Well, anything for immunocompromised, right?
the only lingering thing that I take is baby aspirin. That's it.
Wow.
So
What?
like
So
back to normal health
cool.
levels, like back to everything, like, and they follow you 2 years afterwards to test, just make sure everything's kind of back to status quo where you were when you started. Honestly, I would say, I'm probably healthier probably now, because I learned so many healthy habits from
Yeah.
being like kind of in this process. Like, I definitely drink more water and things like that.
Oh my goodness. So how old's your son now?
He's 3.
Oh, that's amazing. And do you feel like a lot, I mean, you must feel like a lot of that's in the rear view mirror, and now you have your son, and like,
I know it feels surreal. Sometimes my husband and I will look at each other and be like, he's such a blessing, and like, oh my gosh, like we did a uterus transplant. Like, who are we? It doesn't seem real sometimes, but I would say that nowadays the big thing that, my surgeon actually from Penn, she actually ended up starting her own program. So not a trial anymore, but there's an actual program. in UAB. So I remember she reached out to me and she's like, hey, can you share this in your Facebook groups? Like, that's how we got some of our best candidates, or like online or on social media. So, after sharing that, one of the most beautiful things is like, the women who then ended up applying for that program, like talk to me all the time. It's like kind of paying it forward to the women who, helped me through my journey. And I would say that like we're each other's cheerleaders for sure. Like that, and that's kind of where my advocacy now is just showing like, hey, this is like a possibility. And like there's more and more programs popping up, not only in America, Texas Children's Hospital in Houston is starting a program. And one of the really cool things about their program is they're actually going to offer IVF as part of the program as well. So you won't have to fund your IVF process there. If you're accepted into their program, IVF is part of that.
That's
So
amazing.
like that to some people, like that was a barrier that now programs are starting to also think about as well. And if you're following along or want to follow along on some journeys, there's a lot of really great social media people to follow. There's a few that just happened in Australia. So Australia just had another transplant like a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago at this point, and following their process, which is really cool to do in real time if you're like interested. And then, as I said, there's so many.
Share like the social media sites, and then I would love to link the programs. I know you mentioned, you said UAB, was that a program?
Yeah, UAB, Texas Children's, there's one at Baylor, and then Cleveland Clinic, and then UPenn. And then the one place I'd like to always just say check is clinicaltrials.gov is constantly posting clinical trials. So not only ones in America, but like it's constantly refreshed for all over the world. France just had, another uterus transplant baby birth, Spain, Italy, India. It's really growing and it's so cool.
So cool. And I hear you talk about finances, and obviously I'm making the assumption, but with the trial, is it funded by the?
Yeah, so the way they designated it for my trial, and it's different really at every hospital, kind of how they want to do the financial pieces. So that's definitely something to talk about if you are really considering a specific place. For my trial, anything that was related back to the transplant was covered through the program. If anything was related to the pregnancy, we would run it through insurance or I would pay for it myself. And then obviously IVF was to be previously done really before being listed for a transplant. So that would have been on your own as well. But as I said, every program's a little different. Now some programs are including IVF. So it's definitely something that depending on where you are and, kind of your interest levels, these programs, some of them are only deceased donors, some are both styles. I know my program at Penn ended up doing 2 deceased and a living, and some really beautiful stories about the living donors and like, kind of how everybody sort of becomes one big happy family with those as well. So
That's beautiful. And I just think, because surrogacy, gestational care, it's 150,000 flat, really, just for that is what the average cost is. And so I think a lot of women, this would be a really great option for. I mean, there's probably not a lot of people that just have $150,000 to spend. So this is so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing your story and continue to advocate for uterine transplant.
well, thank you for letting me be able to kind of share it and talk about, what's happening, because I think, the more people who are able to see this talked about, know about it, it's not as so surreal or so science fiction. It's real, it's happening, and more babies are being born, and it's such a beautiful path to parenthood. It's a new option, and it warms my heart that I can share that.
Well, thank you. Do you have anything else? I mean, you've shared so much with our listeners. Do you have anything else, leaving notes, leaving thoughts you want to share, maybe with a woman that's listening, thinking, I have MRKH, like, wow, this is something I wasn't thinking about, and maybe I'm going to reach out.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is don't keep yourself sort of in what other people told you your life was going to be like. If you're passionate about pursuing a different path to how you want to build your family, I think you should go for it. It can be really scary, but if you put your mind to something and really work with a great team, like it can have the best results. So
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm going to link your Instagram if that's okay, and I will link all the other programs too in our show notes.